Picture two ancient kingdoms locked in negotiations over a stretch of land. On paper, it's about territory, about borders, about tribute owed. But underneath all of that, the actual thing both sides are really fighting to control isn't the land itself. It's what grows on it. A specific plant, a specific route, a specific substance that one side has and the other side desperately needs and is willing to send armies to secure. This isn't a hypothetical. This is how a surprising number of ancient conflicts actually started, and almost none of them get remembered that way in the history books. A quick note before we get into it. This video looks at the documented historical and economic causes behind ancient conflicts as a factual question about trade and geopolitics, not as commentary on anything happening today. Let's start with the clearest, most direct case, because it's almost embarrassingly literal. The incense route. For roughly 1,000 years, from around the 8th century BC through the early centuries AD, one of the most valuable trade commodities on Earth wasn't gold or silver. It was frankincense and myrrh, aromatic resins harvested from trees that grew in only a handful of specific regions, primarily in what's now Yemen and Oman, in the southern Arabian Peninsula. These weren't just pleasant-smelling luxuries. They were used constantly across the ancient world in religious rituals, in medicine, in embalming, and, according to a growing body of archaeological and pharmacological research, they carried genuine psychoactive properties. Burning frankincense releases a compound called insensyl acetate, which has been shown in modern studies to activate specific ion channels in the brain associated with mood regulation, producing measurable anti-anxiety and mildly euphoric effects. Ancient temples burning enormous quantities of this resin during religious ceremonies weren't just creating pleasant atmosphere. They were, likely without any modern chemical vocabulary to describe it, deliberately dosing entire congregations with a substance that altered how they felt. This mattered enormously, because it meant these resins were essential religious and medical commodities, not optional luxuries. Across Egypt, Mesopotamia, Greece, and later Rome, and the entire supply came from one narrow, difficult-to-access region. The kingdoms who controlled that harvest, and more importantly, controlled the caravan routes that carried it north through the Arabian desert to Mediterranean markets, held an almost unbelievable degree of economic and political leverage. The Sabaean and later Himyarite kingdoms in southern Arabia grew extraordinarily wealthy and powerful, specifically by controlling this trade. And multiple documented ancient conflicts, including Roman military campaigns into Arabia during the reign of Augustus, were driven directly by the desire to seize control of, or at least directly access, that supply chain rather than continuing to pay the enormous markups charged by middleman kingdoms along the route. Rome's disastrous expedition into Arabia in 26 BC, led by the prefect Aelius Gallus, was explicitly motivated by exactly this, an attempt to gain direct military and economic control over the incense-producing region, instead of remaining dependent on Arab intermediaries. Let's move to a case that's even more explicitly, undeniably about a specific substance, because this one doesn't require any interpretation at all. It's right there in the name history gave it, the Opium Wars. By the early 19th century, the British East India Company had developed an enormously profitable trade route built specifically around growing opium in British-controlled India and selling it into China, where opium consumption had become widespread despite the Qing dynasty's explicit legal prohibition of the substance. This wasn't incidental trade. It was a deliberate, calculated commercial strategy, because Britain had a persistent trade deficit with China, buying enormous quantities of tea, silk, and porcelain while having relatively little that Chinese markets wanted to buy in return. Opium solved that imbalance completely, creating a captive, expanding market that reversed the flow of silver directly into British coffers. When the Chinese government, alarmed by the social devastation, the addiction crisis, and the enormous outflow of silver leaving the country, attempted to actually enforce its existing prohibition in 1839, ordering the seizure and destruction of over 1,000 tons of British opium stockpiled at Canton, Britain responded with military force. The resulting conflict, and a second one 2 decades later, ended in decisive British victories, forcing China into what are now known as the unequal treaties, ceding Hong Kong, opening additional ports to foreign trade, and formally guaranteeing continued legal access for the opium trade Britain had built its entire commercial strategy around. This is, without any ambiguity or historical reinterpretation required, a war launched specifically to preserve one nation's right to sell an addictive substance into another nation's population against that nation's explicit legal prohibition. It remains one of the clearest documented examples in all of history of armed conflict fought directly over drug trade access. Now, let's go back further and look at a case that's less overtly about the substance itself and more about controlling the routes it traveled on, because this pattern shows up repeatedly throughout ancient trade history. The Silk Road wasn't just silk. Alongside textiles and spices, it carried substantial quantities of substances with genuine psychoactive and medicinal significance, including cannabis, opium poppy cultivation and trade knowledge, and various other plants moving between Central Asia, China, India, and the Mediterranean world. Control over specific stretches of these routes, particularly the mountain passes and oasis cities that caravans depended on for water, safety, and resupply, was fiercely contested across centuries, precisely because whoever controlled those choke points could tax, redirect, or cut off trade entirely, including trade in substances that specific regions had come to depend on both medically and economically. The Kushan Empire, controlling key sections of these routes through Central Asia and northern India from roughly the 1st through 3rd centuries AD, built enormous wealth and political influence specifically through this position, and multiple documented military conflicts throughout the region's history were fought at least partly over control of these specific choke points, rather than territory for its own sake. Let's look at one more case, because it involves not a substance being traded, but a substance allegedly being used to gain unfair advantage in battle itself, which raises an entirely different question about what counts as a drug war. We've covered on this channel before the connection between henbane, tropane alkaloids, and the berserker warriors of Viking Age Scandinavia. There's a related, less commonly discussed thread here worth mentioning. Some historians have proposed that access to and control over specific psychoactive plants used to induce these battle states may have factored into intergroup conflict and raiding patterns among some Norse and Germanic groups, essentially disputes over who had access to substances that provided a genuine, if brutal, battlefield advantage. This is considerably more speculative than the opium wars or the incense route. The evidence here is thinner and more contested among historians, and it's worth being honest about that uncertainty rather than presenting it as settled fact. But it does point toward a genuinely under-examined category of ancient conflict. Wars or raids fought at least partly over access to substances valued not for trade, profit, but for direct military or ritual advantage in combat itself. So here's what ties all of these cases together, and it's worth stepping back to see the actual pattern rather than treating each one as an isolated historical curiosity. Ancient wars over substances weren't usually framed, at the time, as being about the substance itself. The opium wars get their name from us, looking backward, not from how contemporary British officials publicly justified the conflict, which leaned heavily on diplomatic grievance and free trade principles rather than openly stating, "We are fighting to preserve our right to sell opium." Rome's Arabian campaign was framed as securing valuable trade and expanding imperial reach, not explicitly as "we need direct control over the incense supply." The substance itself was almost always the actual underlying economic engine, while the public justification tended to focus on trade rights, territorial sovereignty, or diplomatic insult. This matters because it tells us something important about how to actually read ancient conflict more broadly. When historians and history-adjacent content look at ancient wars, the stated causes, honor, territory, succession disputes, religious conflict are frequently real, but they often sit on top of a deeper economic layer that gets less attention specifically because it's less flattering to write about. Nobody wants their war remembered as "we invaded because we needed the drug supply." They want it remembered as expanding civilization, defending honor, securing rightful territory. The substance-driven motivation doesn't disappear from the historical record, but it frequently gets pushed underneath the more dignified official justification, which means if you're only reading the stated causes of ancient conflicts, you're very likely missing a substantial economic layer running underneath many of them. So did ancient wars start because of drugs? Based on the documented historical record, yes, repeatedly, and often more directly than most standard history education acknowledges. Sometimes explicitly, as with the Opium Wars, where the connection is undeniable and built directly into the name history gave the conflict. Sometimes through control of trade routes and choke points carrying substances alongside other valuable goods, as with the incense route and sections of the Silk Road. And sometimes, more speculatively but still worth acknowledging, through disputes over access to substances valued for battlefield advantage rather than trade profit at all. What connects every single one of these cases is the same underlying truth this entire channel keeps circling back to, over and over, across every video we've made. Substances that alter human consciousness have never been a minor sideline in human history, confined to private, personal experience. They've been valuable enough, desired enough, and economically significant enough to shape trade routes, topple the balance of empires, and, in more than one well-documented case, to be worth killing and dying over on a genuinely massive scale. The plant, the resin, the poppy, whatever the specific substance happened to be in any given century, was never just about the individual experience of using it. It was, again and again, throughout ancient and early modern history, worth going to war over.